All right, well, good evening. Thank you for joining us. We're going to spend tonight with a presentation to provide information with the upcoming operating referendum on November 3rd. And so my name is Dan Olson. I'm the superintendent of the Monona Grove School District. Also with us this evening is Jared Rosen. Okay. So also, I'm sorry, with that, with us this evening is Jared Rosing, our Director of Business Services. We also have with us Eric Cass for PMA, our financial consulting firm, to answer any questions we might have with regarding to the operating referendum, as well as Katie Burns-Kaiser, our Director of Communications, and one of our board members, Susan Manning. So thank you for joining us this evening. So I'm going to go ahead and share my screen. Okay, so first of all, this evening, there will be an opportunity for anyone joining us to pose any questions. And so several ways that you can do that. If you can put questions right into the Zoom chat, also can email us at mgreferendum@mgschools.net, or at the end of the presentation, you can unmute and ask directly as well. And so we'll make sure any questions you have are addressed at the end of the presentation, but feel free to email or put in chat questions at any time. If you're watching on YouTube and prefer to view on Zoom, you can go to our website and click on the community information night to get the link. And we do have a participant capacity limit of 1,000, so we should be fine there this evening. All right, so there are really 5 things that we'd like to cover tonight. We'd like to talk about, first of all, the funding and budget, the critical facts that have led us to this referendum. We'd like to talk about the expiration of the 2016 operating referendum, the cost of the $3.7 million operating referendum, and then we'll talk a little bit about the consequences of inaction. And lastly, we'll cover some additional FAQs and talk about opportunities to engage in additional virtual conversations. So let's start by talking about the school funding and budget deficits and why a $3.7 million referendum. So we look at school funding, it's still in the state of Wisconsin is a topic of great debate. It's complex, and we really don't have a viable long-term solution to our state funding for schools. So as we entered our current 2020-21 budget, we actually started with a deficit of about $500,000 from a cast forward from the previous year budget. And so we have proactively made a reduction of $500,000 to produce a balanced budget for this year. Some of those challenges with the budget are things like costs that are uncontrollable, such as utilities and transportation and so on, fixed costs that move with us, from year to year and generally have inflationary increases. When we talk about inflation, statewide in the last decade alone, school districts have seen increases in school budgets due to inflation, and quite a bit more than when compared to looking at the growth of allowable revenue limits. And according to the Wisconsin Policy Forum, over the last 10 years, inflation rose statewide at about 17%. At the same time, the average statewide revenue limit grew by only 6% for school districts. And so although progress is made in recent years to close the widening gap through per pupil aid, it really only makes up a portion of the discrepancy. So this chart shows a historical value of the per pupil aid that school districts have received in Wisconsin. And you'll notice that per pupil aid was added to supplement revenue limits in 2012-13, but even with that, it really only makes up for a portion of the discrepancy. And so if you look back to 2008, 2009, those per pupil increases that school districts receive were just under $300 per student, which really were pretty close to inflationary increases. And then over time, you'll see that those per pupil amounts have decreased steadily. In some years, there were actually no increases. The big reduction in 11-12 coincided with Act 10. And so when you take a look at where we're at today, we're kind of at that per pupil aid area, very similar to where we were at back in 2008. So there are really three key components to this year's operational referendum and the rationale for the timing as well as the dollar amount. The first thing is that this coincides with the expiration of our operational referendum from 2016. Secondly, the referendum is very much about providing funding to maintain our ability to attract and retain highly qualified teachers. And thirdly, to address the impact of COVID-19 on our budget. So we look at the expiration of the 2016 operating referendum. At that time, our community approved a 5-year operating referendum. That referendum allowed us to maintain existing staff, programs, and services, but it really did little to address the rising inflation, teacher salaries, or provide long-term funding solution. So again, that referendum expires at the end of this school year, and so we're looking at this time as a renewal of that operating referendum from 2016 in order to, again, maintain the programs and funding. Secondly, when we look at our ability to attract and retain highly qualified teachers, clearly that's the most important thing we do as a school district, and we need to recognize that our ability to do so is very much based upon having competitive salaries. Statewide, there's been about a 29% decrease in teacher graduates since 2011, along with an 18% increase in teacher retirements over 2019. And so there definitely is a challenge and a shortage of teachers, which make things that much more competitive in trying to hire and retain quality teachers. And so we look at our salaries compared to other school districts, or comparable districts, particularly in Dane County, are behind in our salary, and this referendum will give us an opportunity to help provide more competitive salaries. It may not be possible to fully align, but take a step towards being more competitive. And then the third key component is the impact of COVID-19. Given that the pandemic is ongoing, we really don't know the full cost. These are often difficult questions to fill as we will look to pivot quickly in reopening. We want to make sure that the plan is not thwarted by a lack of things like bus drivers, school nutrition staff. And so when we look ahead at future years, we really project potentially as much of a $700,000 decrease in our state aid. And so given that uncertainty of how this may impact our budget, this operating referendum, again, would provide the opportunity to have that flexibility and to adjust depending on what those future budgets may look like. When we look at some of those presumed impacts or possible savings, the reality is that there really aren't savings places that we might adjust and see lesser costs in some parts of the budget. There are increased costs in other parts as we adjust. And so staffing, of course, is again one of our key components. As we look to return students to the classroom for in-person instruction and trying to continue to have a virtual option, we're actually going to need more staff in order to do that effectively. Again, at this point, our athletics that aren't in session right now, we're hoping to be able to reopen here as the school year goes on. And so it simply shifts those costs and programming to the spring. Our enrollment, at this point, we have, just like most other school districts in the area, have seen a decrease in enrollment based upon or due to the pandemic, and that impacts our aids as well, as those are directly related to per pupil costs. And we've talked a little bit already about school nutrition, transportation. Those are things that are ongoing, even though the schools are closed, that we're able to continue to provide meals for our students. And then lastly, things like supplies, even though the types of supplies have shifted, where we might not have the same costs in typical classroom supplies, we have some significant increase in costs as we look to things like higher costs for hygiene and safety protocols that need to be put in place. All right, so let's take a look at the tax impact of the proposed referendum. So if the $3.7 million per year were approved, the tax impact over time would be 40 cents per $1,000 of equalized value, or in other words, $40 per $100,000 of fair market value. This chart shows the different increments depending on the fair market value of a property taxpayer or a homeowner. This tax effect would take effect in the December 2021 tax bill. So should the referendum be approved this November, it'd be a full year from now where it would have that impact on our property tax bills. Next slide shows the historical mill rate or tax rate specifically for the school tax levy. For the current year, we're projecting a mill rate of $12.86 per $1,000 of equalized value. Should the referendum be approved, the mill rate would increase to $13.26, which is mentioned a 40 cents increase. And this chart shows, again, the mill rate over time. You'll see there is a pretty significant decrease from 1993 to the early 2000s that coincided with revenue limits and and some increases in state aid. And then it's really been pretty steady over time. And so you'll see again in the long run what this impact would be on the mill rate. So what happens if the referendum fails? Well, certainly the first thing would be that we would have a slightly over $3 million deficit. Again, the referendum provides authority for the school board to levy taxes over the state imposed revenue limits. And so without that authority, there would have to be a significant reduction in the budget. As I mentioned, just over $3 million at a minimum for the first year and likely over $4 million in the years to follow. And so the first thing that would happen is that our school board would have to engage stakeholders and really engage in a process to determine exactly where those reductions would need to occur. The one thing that is certain, though, is that it would impact staffing and programs. Given that our overall budget, about 77% of it is on staffing, for those type of reductions, there definitely would be an impact in that area. So looking ahead at some other specific, FAQs and related to the items that we talked about. So again, going back to 2016, why didn't the April 2016 operating referendum solve our funding programs or our funding problems? And again, this referendum really provided just temporary funding for 5 years, as I mentioned, to maintain staff, programs, and operations. And so the renewal was really due to the unsolved issues with the state funding formula. And so the concerns that existed back in 2016 really still exist today. So again, we really didn't address those inflationary increases as well as the teacher salaries or the impact of the COVID-19 on our budget. Will recent property assessments create an increase in the school portion of my tax bill? So the Village of Cottage Grove has recently undergone or is in the process of going through a tax reassessment, as all municipalities do from time to time. And the impact of reassessments will be unique to each property owner. Again, by definition, the municipality undertakes the revaluation to distribute the tax burden fairly and equitably among the taxable properties in accordance with the law. So the reality is that it redistributes the taxes, but under no circumstances would the school district realize any increase in revenue due to the reevaluations. Does an increase in business development, particularly in Cottage Grove, decrease the school portion of my tax bill? And again, this can be a little bit of a complex issue, but the reality is that when school districts determine the annual total tax levy, then it's up to the municipalities to distribute the levy across property tax payers. So again, the overall levy is not impacted. It's really how that is distributed amongst the different, again, taxpayers in the municipality. And so in general, things like the TIDs, tax incremental districts, have an impact on that evaluation, the state equalization aid, and overall higher overall property values can also contribute to then receiving less state aid. And so there are a number of factors that will have an impact, and it's difficult to determine exactly, how that might have an impact on an individual's property tax bill. Okay, so moving forward after this evening, as far as other opportunities to engage in question and answer, or get your questions answered by our staff, we've had a number of virtual open doors. We'll continue to have those right up until the time of the referendum. So there are 2 more scheduled on October 19th and 26th. The details are on our website about how to link into those virtual open doors. Also, again, on our website, there's all kinds of detailed information about everything, related to the referendum. Voter information. Of course, we want to make sure that our property owners and our constituents are informed voters. And so we want to encourage all of our community members to vote and vote safely by November 3rd. And so there's also information on our website to link you to voter registration information and how you can vote in your local municipality as well. And then contacting us with further questions or comments. Again, there's information on our website. We have our email addresses set up specifically to ask questions regarding the referendum. And for those of you that might want to speak to someone over the phone, myself and Jared Rosing, our Business Services Director, are both available. Our phone information is listed there also. Okay, so at this time, we'll pause and have an opportunity for any questions that we might have. So again, if you are on our Zoom link, you can submit any questions right directly on the Zoom link through the chat feature. You can also email questions in to MG to the MG referendum at mgschools.net. Or if you're joining us, you can unmute and simply ask your questions as well. Okay, so we do have a question. Is it common for districts in Dane County to go to referendum? And that's a great question. And so there are 2 types of referendums that districts will consider operating referendum, as we're discussing this evening, as well as facilities referendums. Facilities are specifically for bonding for school construction, new schools, remodeling, and so on, where operating referendums are specifically for the authority to levy above the imposed revenue limits. And so in Dane County, yes, it is common, as well as around the state. When we look at the state budget over, really the last decade, and that one slide showed the reduction in revenue limits and per pupil aid per students, the legislature really had set it up that they were, as districts received lesser authority to levy through the revenue limits, that one way of increasing budgets is strictly by going through that through referendums and getting approval from the local taxpayers. And so it is quite common that districts will pass an operating referendum like we did. Many times there is a number of years that will be in place. And then when that expires, it's very typical to renew either at the same amount or a similar amount moving forward. Okay, thank you. We have another question. Do we have any projections for the district budget after the 24-25 school year? That's a great question. I think I'll turn that over to Jared Rosing to respond.
Yes, excuse me. The district works off of a 5-year projection. Our state budget is based off of a 2-year cycle. So the farther out we get, it gets a little bit more unpredictable. The referendum that we are proposing is a 4-year non-reoccurring. However, that does present the challenge that the board will have to make the decision to renew that. And what does that look like? Obviously, as the district continues to grow, with additional students in the district, it does bring in additional revenue. And so I think that the district is in a unique opportunity as we're starting to see additional growth in the village of Cottage Grove with new apartments and new residential subdivisions. And that was part of the reason that we did go to a facilities referendum, because based on our enrollment projections over the next 10 to 15 years, we do anticipate additional 700 students on the lower end, up to 2,000 on the higher end. So that will bring additional revenue in. However, once we get to that 24-25 school year, the district that becomes a ways out. So the predictability is pretty low. However, we do look at a 5-year cycle on our budget.
Okay, our next question. Monona pays about twice as much per child as the rest of the district with all new development in Cottage Grove. Why is it in Monona residents' interest to continue to subsidize Cottage Grove and not separate the school districts? So I don't know if, Jared, you'd like to talk a little bit about the apportionment, perhaps first, between the two communities and how that is apportioned as far as through the tax levy, and then we can talk a little bit about how that impacts, if the districts, were separate.
Sure, and we'll also probably tap into Eric Cass as well to assist us in this. So you are correct, about 54% of our property evaluation does come from the city of Monona, and about 30% is coming from the village of Cottage Grove. However, when we look at the state funding formula, it is based off of students and property value. So with the city of Monona having a much larger property value per student, it does decrease the amount of state aid the district receives. However, in the village of Cottage Grove, having more students and less of a property value, obviously that would create additional state aid. And so when you combine those two communities together, it does put us in a very unique situation where the district overall receives less state aid, or we're classified as a property-rich school district, creating the district receiving less state aid from the state. If we were to divide the two communities up, obviously this was a conversation that happened a number of years ago. We would see that based on the population of students in the city of Monona, there would actually be a much more higher tax burden, because the number of students in the city of Monona over the property value would actually require the property taxpayers to pay additional property taxes for that, compared to the village of Cottage Grove, where there would be more students per property value, and in the eyes of the state, it's receiving additional state aid. But I will also tap into Eric Cass, who is from PMA, to also expand on that a little bit farther as well.
Yeah, I think you did a great job, Jared. The only thing I would add is when communities go through reassessments, which my understanding is Cottage Grove just did, there's two different ways that assessments happen and how property taxes are apportioned. There's an assessed value and there's an equalized value. And so for school districts, the Department of Revenue actually calculates and certifies what's called the equalized value. And that is completely separate and different than the local assessed value. And really, from a macro level, what the difference is that your local assessor assesses on a parcel value. And sometimes they do that yearly, sometimes they do that every 2 years, and sometimes up to 3 years. And so you get different assessment ratios. And so that forces the Department of Revenue to do what's called equalizing. And so they value the entire community, whether it be a city, a village, or a town, as one entity rather than individual properties. And what that does is it helps minimize the impact of differentiated tax rates on multiple communities. So for school districts such as Monona that have multiple municipalities, having the equalized value really equitably supports that mill rate over the entire properties, not just on the individual property like a local assessment would do.
So I would add just one other piece. In addition to the impact on the property taxpayer, if the communities were to have separate school districts, there would be a significant impact as well on the academic and co-curricular programs, that would be available for our students. If we look at our current high school, for example, of about 1,100 students, only about 300 of those students are City of Monona residents. And so to operate a high school of that few number of students, it's very difficult to offer the same rich, curriculum and course opportunities, as well as extracurriculars, opportunities as well. So as Jared mentioned, I think there was a pretty detailed study done by the district back approximately 10 years ago, analyzing not only the impact on the taxpayers, but as well as that impact on programming, for our students. So again, just announce anyone who may have just joined, you can If you join us on the Zoom link, you can submit any questions through the chat box. You can also send a message to mgreferendum@mgschools.net, or you're certainly welcome to unmute and ask a question directly. Well, again, those of you that have joined us, really appreciate this. We'll definitely stay on here for a while to see if anyone else joins in or has any other questions to submit. Want to, thank again the folks that are joining us this evening, participating with this, as well as our teachers who have joined us. Thank you, Mr. S, for taking some time with us this evening. Okay, so I do have a comment that I'll go ahead and read. Not a specific question, but a big shout out to Dr. Olson and the crew at the district office, as well as the board, maintaining transparency and being open and honest to feedback and conversation. As a teacher, I thank you all. And again, we really appreciate you, Mr. Esch, as well as the rest of our teachers. Again, the staff as well. Not anything that I should take credit for, but am really proud of the staff that we have here, throughout the entire district, as well as our board for the support that they have for us.
Good night. Thank you all.
Good night. Thank you for joining us.
Thank you guys very much for all the work you've done on getting the information out. And Dan, I know for you've been all day in meetings, so thank you very much.
Well, thank you for as well taking time. So we'll hang on here for a little bit.
If you had gotten dinner yet. Yeah. And then at 7 o'clock is the Monona meeting.
Yeah.
So, thank you very much. Good night.
Thank you, Susan. Hey, well, again, thank you for those of you that took some time with us this evening. Just want to, again, reiterate, if you have any questions, we really would like to hear from you. You can contact us several different ways. All of our information is on our district website, email at mgreferendum@mgschools.net, or you can contact Jared Rose